An affordable 240Hz curved VA gaming monitor, at least that's what we're promised, coming in at £430 in the UK. It's called the Philips Evnia 27M2C5500W. I can't believe I actually remembered that, but who on earth comes up with these names? Anyway, in this video we're going to see if it's actually worth its price tag and how it compares to its competitors. So to kick things off, let's jump straight in and talk about its input lag. And here I had it objectively tested at 2.9 milliseconds and 7.5 milliseconds. Now in case you're wondering why there's a discrepancy in that, because for some god-given reason Philips include an input lag on and off mode. No idea why, but anyway, with it on is what you're probably going to want to use because it gives you the lowest input lag. And indeed over here you can see how it compares to some other 1440p gaming monitors, including high refresh rate ones. Now in terms of my subjective opinion, I must say the input lag is pretty impressive. Indeed, my mouse clicks when I was playing a hardcore competitive game such as Counter-Strike Global Offensive wasn't feeling that it was hindered by the gaming monitor. Instead it was probably my poor aim, or indeed the fact that I was running a curved monitor when in reality I'm not really used to it. So what about when it comes to its response time? Well, here I had it objectively tested via the OSRTT tool, and with the overdrive set to off I had a whopping 10.14 milliseconds average initial time, which you can see at the bottom left hand side of your screen, and it translates to the average D to G. So yes, pretty poor. But then we switched over to the fast overdrive and you can see that the time reduces to 8.98 milliseconds. Moving over to the faster preset, here's where things get interesting. An average initial time of 5.64. Not too shabby, but not exactly great for a 240Hz monitor. So what about on terms of its fastest mode preset? Well, hey presto, we've got 2.9 milliseconds, and that is pretty impressive. Well, yes, but until you look at the RGB overshoot. Towards the middle of your screen you can see a lot of red and orange and yellow. As we switch over to the faster mode preset, you can see it's all green. What does this mean? Well, effectively on the highest mode preset you've got some inverse ghosting, which you'll be able to see via the UFO ghosting test. Indeed, it is noticeable, and even in a potato looking game like Counter-Strike Global Offensive, it did throw off my vision and thus my shots, meaning that I really had to run on terms of its faster mode preset in order for me to get a good visual experience. Now aside from this, I should point out that the monitor has got some VA smearing, which is unfortunate, specifically towards the lower overdrive modes. This is certainly not present on the likes of the Samsung Odyssey G7, its nearest competitor. Now, for you to get a clearer image, you might want to enable MBR, and indeed that is the plethora of other UFOs that you can see on your screen. Now, MBR 20, whereby you can adjust the different increment levels, is certainly appreciated. Better still, you can actually adjust the overdrive mode within MBR as well, which is quite rare, but it's absolutely great to see. Now, in this respect, you have also got MBR sync. Now, as you'll see for your own eyes, it is completely pointless, and I don't really understand the inclusion of it because it doesn't exactly do what it says on the tin. In other words, reducing the motion blur. So in other words, if you do want to lower the motion blur and get a clearer image, then you'll certainly want to go with the MBR mode instead of the MBR sync mode. Now, just to expand on all of this and adding my subjective opinion, while playing a game such as Counter-Strike, and as I did mention before, running in terms of its fastest mode preset did incur some inverse ghosting. But on the flip side, I felt that the monitor was responding phenomenally well, and therefore meant that I was actually siding towards using the fastest mode preset while playing a hardcore competitive game. But again, here, if I wanted a better visual experience, I'll dial it down to the faster mode preset. But suddenly here, the monitor's response time seemed to be hampering my overall experience, and thus not responding as I would expect, at least for a 240Hz monitor aimed at the competitive crowd. So effectively, what I'm trying to say over here is that I either had a worse visual experience but a faster monitor, or a slower monitor but then one that actually looked a little bit better. Now, with all of that aside, I should point out that MBR and MBR Sync do not run simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies, thus NVIDIA G-Sync or AMD FreeSync. This is a slight shame, but is somewhat normal behavior, as is the case with a lot of its competitors. Now, this does actually bring me onto VRR, whereby you have got a range of 48 up to 240Hz. At least in my case, I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo while connected over DisplayPort to my RTX 3080. I didn't incur any sort of flickering or black screen issues. Now it is worth bearing in mind that if you were to drop under 48 Hz due to this monitor not having a native G-Sync module, thus not benefiting from the full VRR range, you might notice a little bit of stuttering. So of course here it really depends in terms of the GPU power or indeed the frames that you're pushing in said game. Now furthermore, I was able to run Nvidia G-Sync while simultaneously having an HDR signal and playing at 1440p at 240 Hz, which is certainly a great combination, at least when you're playing more casual games. I would never recommend running adaptive sync technologies while playing hardcore competitive games because you just don't want to cap your frames and or incur any bit of input lag. Now in this respect, the overall experience was pretty good. But I should also point out that the HDR experience was actually really impressive. Now the manufacturer claims that you will have display HDR 400 certification, and more often than not that means a pretty poor HDR experience. But in this respect, my monitor was actually tested at 667 nits, which is absolutely ridiculously past the HDR 400 certification. So yes, it gets really bright, and as a result of that, when running an HDR signal, you'll actually get a really good experience, and one that will compete with a lot of its competitors, and ones that are actually a little bit more premium in terms of the price tag that they come in at. Now with that in mind, I would like to point out that this monitor does accept a 4K signal input while simultaneously running HDR, which is all very much appreciated, at least if you're a console gamer. I can't quite attest to it because I don't have a modern console, but in this respect it should work. Equally, you should be able to attain 1440p at 120 Hz. Now for PC gamers, you'll certainly want to be plugged in over DisplayPort, and that's because due to the monitor's limitations of HDMI 2.0, it means that you cannot achieve more than 144 Hz at 1440p, while at DisplayPort you can achieve the full 240 Hz refresh rate at said resolution. Now with the gaming section out of the way, we get onto image quality. How does it actually look like? Well, it runs 1440p at 240 Hz, has a VA panel with a matte coating on it, and a 1000R curvature. Now I would like to point out that it does have an sRGB gamut clamp, which is certainly appreciated, although accessing it is a little bit mind-boggling. For some given reason you have to enable adaptive sync technologies, which is certainly the first I've ever come across, and potentially this might be addressed via future firmware updates via Philips, but at least at the time of filming that's not the case. Now with that in mind, for the first time, at least for the last decade, here you can actually adjust the brightness levels with the sRGB gamut clamp enabled. Woohoo! Finally Philips, we got there. But there is a caveat to this. You cannot actually adjust the RGB gain values. In other words, the red, the green and blue, if you want to adjust it in terms of having a custom user profile, then you're just not going to be able to, because for some given reason Philips thought it would be a great idea just to completely take it out of the OSD. With that said, the sRGB mode is pinpoint color accurate. Now put across my calibrators, I noticed a 98.4% sRGB gamut coverage and a gamut volume of 109.5%. Here, the average delta E sits at 1.3 with a maximum of 3.68. So yes, I would certainly consider this for some serious image editing work or indeed video grading. Now as for its tested contrast ratio, it gets up to a whopping 3,329 to 1, indeed far surpassing the manufacturer's claim and indeed completely trumping any sort of IPS panel. As for its measured white point, it's not as impressive. Given the 6,504 Kelvin target, it hit 5,768 Kelvin at 100%. On the flip side, the gamma curve is absolutely excellent, hitting the 2.2 standards pretty much throughout. Now if you're not going to be editing any photos and you want a wider color gamut, you might want to disable the sRGB gamut clamp, and indeed this monitor has got a wide color gamut, extending towards the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 modes, although it doesn't hit these standards in the slightest. It should be worth mentioning that the figures that you can see on your screen are based on the sRGB mode, thus it's no surprise over here that you can see that the color accuracy is off. As for the gamma curve, it is actually pretty close, but it isn't exactly on point in comparison to the 2.2 standard that I showcased before. Now you might have noticed the brightness figures on your screen, so let's just quickly dive into them. Maximum brightness sitting at 667 nits, which is certainly appreciated, although the minimum brightness sitting at 106 nits is pretty bright to say the least. For those people wanting to play in a completely pitch black room, this might be actually quite disappointing. On the flip side, the MBR20 brightness sits at 170 nits and therefore is perfectly usable even in a bright sunlit room. Now moving past peak luminance, I should point out that the brightness uniformity of my Tesla panel wasn't too bad across the board, and similarly when it came to the backlight bleed. Here you do notice a little bit of bleed coming in towards the corners due to its curved nature, but it isn't too bad, and given the fantastic contrast ratio of this monitor, it can certainly be used for playing darker games, or indeed if you're going to be watching movies that have certain darker scenes. Now moving past the test, I would like to have a quick word about the monitor's build quality, and here it's got a 3-side borderless design, and as I did mention before, it's got a 1000R curvature. Now as for the stand, it provides you height, swivel and tilt adjustments, all of which are appreciated for you to get the best sort of ergonomics. Of course, if you do not want the sturdy stand, you can replace it via VESA compatible stand, for example if you have it on a monitor arm. Now as for the rear design of the monitor, it certainly does look the part. Yes, it doesn't have those fancy and completely nonsensical RGB lights, but instead actually has a lot more of a mature type of look to it. No complaints whatsoever. Now on the flip side, the monitor does not have any built-in speakers, which really doesn't bother me in the slightest, but if you do want to output audio directly from the monitor, then you've got a 3.5mm jack, which sits alongside some USB Type-A ports, which can be handy if you're plugging in your peripherals directly into the monitor. Now on that note, if you do want to adjust the volume while outputting audio via that 3.5mm jack, there is the OSD, which can be accessed via a little joystick button found behind the monitor. Now the OSD is very snazzy looking, but unfortunately where it comes to functionality is disappointing. It's a little bit convoluted in terms of accessing said menus, and furthermore is a little bit slow to respond, which is quite a shame, but hopefully Philips might be able to address this via future firmware updates. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and while the Philips monitor was very promising from the get-go, specifically given its price point and the specs that it offered, it doesn't quite hit the mark, at least not for a hardcore competitive gamer. See, in this respect, its response time is quite lackluster, at least specifically in comparison to its main competitor, the Samsung Odyssey G7, which would still be my top pick if you want a 1440p curved VA 240Hz monitor. Now aside from this, you have got excellent IPS monitors on the market, from the likes of AOC, Asus and even Alienware, all of which I can actively recommend. Now the reviews of some of these monitors will be down in the description below for your own consideration. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of this Philips monitor, and in terms of if you own it, what are your experiences? Now if you've liked this independent detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which are certainly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.